Money has ears. Florence Shinn taught you how to give it orders. Matthew 8:9 explained. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that your money has been listening to you your entire life, catching every tired word you have ever spoken over it. And tonight, you are going to learn exactly what it has heard. There is a soldier in the Bible who understood something most people never learn about authority. In the book of Matthew, chapter 8, verse 9, he says to Jesus, "For I am a man under authority, having soldiers under me, and I say to this man, 'Go,' and he goeth, and to another, 'Come,' and he cometh, and to my servant, 'Do this,' and he doeth it." That is the centurion speaking in Matthew 8:9, and Florence Scovel Shinn would stop you right there and say, "Do you see it?" He did not beg his soldiers. He did not send them a worried little wish and hope it found its way home. He simply spoke from a settled place of rightful command, because he stood in the consciousness of one who had the right to give orders and be obeyed. And the moment you understand that money is a soldier under your authority, waiting only for a clear voice, everything in your life begins to shift. And here is where most people go wrong without ever knowing it. They think the work is chasing money, pleading with money, worrying it into their hands one anxious thought at a time, when the real work was never chasing, it was commanding, from a calm and settled state. And if you have spent years asking money nicely and receiving nothing but silence in return, you are not the only one. It was never some personal failure of yours. You simply were never taught that money has ears and that it has been taking orders from you the whole time, just not the orders you meant to give. So before we go any further, let us give money its very first clear order. Right now, out loud if you are able, say it with me. Money hears me now. Money moves for me now. My word is my wand. Again. Money hears me now. Money moves for me now. My word is my wand. And if something in you just went quiet when you said that, if some old, tired part of you finally exhaled, then type the words, "I command money," in the comments below. Right now, let it be your seal. Let it be the first order you have ever given in writing. The first key is this: stop asking money to come and start telling it where to go. Most people spend their whole lives phrasing every wish about money as a small, hopeful question. They say things like, "I wonder if I will make rent. I hope this check comes through. I sure hope business picks up soon." And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this kind of speech is exactly backward, because it is not a request that moves supply, it is a command, spoken from a state of certainty that moves supply. Think about the centurion again for a moment. He never once said, "I hope my soldier obeys me." He said, "I say," and it is done. That is the tone your money is actually listening for. And notice something else about him too. He did not raise his voice. He did not repeat himself 5 times to be sure he was heard. He simply spoke once, from a place so settled that repetition never even occurred to him. That is the very thing Florence Scovel Shinn kept pointing her students back toward. Not louder words, not more words, simply a different place to speak them from. Picture a woman standing at her kitchen counter with the bills spread out in front of her, the same counter she has stood at 100 times before, sighing the same sigh, saying the same tired thing. "I do not know how I am going to cover all this." And every single time she says it, she is giving an order, just not the one she meant to give. So tonight, instead, she stands up straight, and she says out loud, "This money is paid, in full, right on time. And I thank you." That is not pretending. That is not denial. That is a woman remembering that her word is a wand and not a whimper. Notice she did not say, "I hope this money is paid." She did not say, "This money might be paid if I am lucky." She said it plainly, the way you would state a fact you already knew to be true. It is not weakness to speak this way. It is authority. It is not foolish to talk to your money as though it can hear you. It is the very thing Florence Scovel Shinn taught her students to do every single day. Because money, like every form of supply, responds to the state behind the word far more than it responds to the facts currently sitting on the page. Think of it this way. A command spoken in fear is still, underneath, only a question wearing a firm tone. And money hears the fear before it hears the tone. So this week, notice every time a hopeful little question slips out of your mouth about money, catch yourself mid-sentence if you have to, and turn it around into a calm, plain command, not shouted, not desperate, just certain, the way a person speaks who already knows the outcome. You might even try it on something small first. Standing in line at the store, thinking quietly, this card goes through with ease. Rather than the anxious little questions so many people carry silently to the register without ever noticing they are carrying it at all. This is the smallest key, and yet it is often the first one that unlocks everything else. Because until you know you have the right to command, you will keep quietly begging. And begging is a state that can only attract more reasons to beg. So starting today, you speak differently. And everything you speak to differently starts, slowly and then suddenly, to answer differently too. My word commands, and money obeys. The second key is this. Your money is not reading your bank statement. It is reading your self-concept. Florence Scovel Shinn taught again and again that a person's outer circumstances are simply the visible photograph of an inward state. And nowhere is this more painfully true than with money. You can move to a new city, take a new job, open a new account, and if your self-concept has not changed, you will find yourself, within a season or two, standing in almost the exact same financial spot you left. Because it was never the account that was small, it was the concept of self that was small, and the account was only ever following orders. Think of two people who each receive the very same unexpected sum of money. One of them holds a quiet, settled concept of herself as someone for whom supply is natural, and that money moves through her hands, some spent, some saved, some given, and somehow, in a way she could not fully explain, more arrives to replace it, almost as if it noticed she was a wide-open channel and simply kept flowing. The other person holds a hidden concept of herself as someone who is always one step behind, always catching up, always slightly unworthy of ease, and that very same sum slips through her fingers in a matter of weeks, not through anything foolish, just through 100 small leaks, because her self-concept had already decided, long before the money ever arrived, exactly how much of it she was allowed to keep. Now let us slow down and watch this play out in an ordinary week, because most people never catch it happening in real time. Imagine a man who receives a small raise at work. On Monday, he feels proud. He tells himself, finally, some breathing room. But underneath that pride, there is an old familiar hum, a quiet voice that has followed him since childhood, whispering, "This will not last." By Tuesday, he has already spent a little more than usual, not recklessly, just a small treat here, a nicer lunch there, telling himself he has earned it. By Wednesday, an unexpected car repair appears, exactly the size of the raise, and he sighs and says, "Of course, that is just how it goes for me." By Thursday, he is back to the same tight feeling he had before the raise ever arrived, and by Friday, if you asked him, he would tell you nothing had really changed, and Florence Scovel Shinn would say, "Look closer, something did change, the money changed." But the self-concept never did, and the self-concept always wins in the end, because the self-concept is the mold, and the money is simply the liquid poured into it. No matter how much liquid you pour, it can only ever take the shape of the mold that is waiting to receive it. This is why Florence Scovel Shinn insisted that the real treasure hunt is never external. It is not a treasure hunt for a better job or a bigger break. It is a treasure hunt within your own consciousness, for the tired old beliefs about who you are that have been quietly signing checks on your behalf for years. Some of these beliefs are loud and easy to spot, but most of them are small and disguised as simple common sense. They sound reasonable. They sound humble even. And that is exactly what makes them so dangerous. A belief that sounds humble can still be a thief, quietly working the night shift while you sleep. So pause for a moment and pick one real belief you carry about your own worth, around money. Maybe it sounds like, people like me never get ahead, or money always disappears on me, or even something as quiet as, I am just not good with money, and once you can name it plainly, you can finally begin to speak a new one over it, not by arguing with the old belief, not by fighting it or shaming yourself for having carried it, but by simply and calmly declaring the truth in its place. I am the kind of person supply flows to easily, and repeating that until it settles from a hopeful sentence into a quiet fact. The way a new path across a field slowly becomes the only path once it has been walked enough times. This is not vanity. This is not arrogance. It is not conceit to know your own worth. It is simply accuracy. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that humility was never meant to mean believing yourself small. Humility simply means seeing yourself truthfully. And the truth, she taught, is that you were never made to be a leaking vessel. You were made to be an open channel. And once your self-concept lifts, even slightly, you will notice money beginning to move differently around you. A bill arrives, and somehow the exact amount appears without strain. An opportunity surfaces that you did not go chasing after. A small, unexpected gift lands at precisely the right week, almost as though it had been waiting the whole time for you to finally believe what it already knew was true about you. And once that inward shift takes hold, the very language you use every day becomes the next place this key must go to work. My concept of myself decides what my money is allowed to do. The third key is this: guard your words about money the way you would guard a locked treasury. Because every casual complaint you speak over your finances is not harmless small talk. It is a small order given to an obedient servant. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the tongue is a creative instrument and that loose talk produces loose results. So when a person says, almost without thinking, money just runs through my hands, or I am always broke by the end of the month, they believe they are simply describing their life, when in truth, they are quietly renewing the very conditions they are describing. It is not description, it is instruction, spoken so lightly that the speaker never even notices she has given an order at all. Think about how easily we say these things at dinner tables, in group chats, standing in line at the store. Someone asks how you are doing, and you say, "Oh, you know, broke as usual," and everyone laughs, and it feels harmless. And yet Florence Scovel Shinn would gently stop you and ask, "Do you understand what you have just ordered? It is not a joke, it is a decree, spoken lightly, but received seriously, by the very consciousness that governs your supply." Picture a man named a friend, texting back and forth with a co-worker about a weekend trip. And when the co-worker asks if he wants to come, he types without a second thought, "Cannot. I am always broke." That phrase leaves his hands in 3 seconds and lands in his own consciousness, the same way a seed lands in soil, quietly, unnoticed, and yet it takes root all the same. Weeks later, he wonders why the same tightness keeps showing up around every invitation, never once connecting it back to the words his own thumbs typed so casually. This is why Florence Scovel Shinn taught her students to become almost fiercely careful with speech, not anxious about it, not walking on eggshells, but alert, the way a person is alert with a lit match near dry paper. It is not superstition to watch your words this closely. It is simply respecting the power that was given to you the moment you were given a voice at all. And it is worth noticing that this key does not only apply to complaints spoken about the past or present, it applies just as strongly to the tired predictions people make about their future. When someone says, "I will probably never get out of debt," or "This is just how it is for people like me," they are not reporting a fact, They are laying a track for the future to run on, and Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the future has a strange habit of arriving exactly along the tracks that have already been spoken for it. So this week, try this small practice. Every time you catch yourself about to speak a tired complaint about money, pause, just for one breath, and instead say something true and steady, such as, "Supply flows to me easily and on time." At first this may feel strange, even a little untrue, but Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the feeling of strangeness fades the moment repetition turns a new sentence into a familiar one, and a familiar sentence eventually becomes a belief, and a belief becomes a state, and a state becomes your life. It is not the words alone that build a life. It is the words spoken again and again until they stop sounding like hope and start sounding like fact. This is not about becoming rigid or humorless around money. It is not pretending your bills do not exist. It is simply remembering that your mouth is not just for describing your life. It is for building it, one order at a time, and once you begin guarding your words this closely, you start to notice something else waiting underneath them. An old self that has been giving most of these tired orders for years without your permission. An old self that learned its language long before you ever chose a single word for yourself. And that old self is exactly where we turn next. My mouth is a gate, and I decide what passes through it. The fourth key is this. The old poverty self must be allowed to die so that the true self of abundant supply can finally live. And I want to be very clear here, because this word death can frighten people when it is misunderstood. Florence Scovel Shinn was never speaking of any literal ending of a person. She was speaking of the quiet dissolving of a false identity, an old, worn-out self-image that was never who you actually were to begin with. It was only a costume you had worn so long you forgot it could be removed. The poverty self is not the real you. It is simply an old set of habits, old fears, old inherited beliefs, wearing your name and answering your phone. And it has been running your financial life on autopilot for years. And it helps, before we go any further, to understand where this old self actually came from. Because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that almost no one invents their own poverty consciousness from scratch. It is handed down, quietly, at kitchen tables, in overheard arguments about bills, in the tight voice of a parent counting coins at the register. A child does not need to be told directly that money is scarce. The child simply watches, and absorbs, and files it away as fact, long before there is any ability to question it. So by the time that child is grown, and standing in her own kitchen with her own bills spread out, she is very often not even speaking her own words at all. She is repeating a recording that was playing long before she ever arrived. This is important to know, because it means the old self was never a personal failure. It was simply inherited furniture, arranged in a room you did not choose. And this fourth key asks you to finally walk through that room and begin moving the furniture out, piece by piece, on purpose. And notice something further about inherited furniture. It rarely matches the room it sits in. A fear that made a certain kind of sense in one generation. A fear born of true famine, true war, true and desperate lack, often gets passed down whole into a life where none of those original conditions exist anymore. So a woman may find herself hoarding, or panicking, or shrinking back from simple ease, and never once understand why, because the fear she is carrying was never actually generated by her own life at all. It was generated somewhere further back, and simply handed to her the way a coat is handed down, long after the winter that required it has passed. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that part of this fourth key is finally asking, whose fear is this? Is this truly mine? Or is this a garment I was simply given as a child and never thought to take off? And the moment you ask that question honestly, the coat already begins to feel looser on your shoulders. Let me walk you through what this old self actually sounds like across a single ordinary day. because most people do not realize how many tiny orders it gives before breakfast is even finished. The alarm goes off, and before the feet even touch the floor, the old self whispers, "Another day of barely making it." That is order number 1, already spoken silently before the sun is even fully up. Then comes the walk to the kitchen, and the old self glances at the coffee and thinks, "I really should not be spending money on this." That is order number 2, guilt dressed up as thrift. Then the phone is checked, and a bank notification appears, and the old self tightens in the chest and says, "Here we go again." That is order number 3, dread given a fresh coat of paint. Then at work, a co-worker mentions a vacation, and the old self says, "Must be nice. Some of us cannot afford that." That is order number 4, comparison turned into a curse on your own supply. Then lunch comes, and the old self counts every dollar twice before ordering the cheaper sandwich. Not from wisdom, but from fear. That is order number 5, scarcity treated as identity rather than circumstance. Then the drive home, and a bill reminder chimes, and the old self says, "Of course," right when I finally had a little breathing room. That is order number 6. And by the time evening comes, the old self is tired, and it climbs into bed, still running the numbers, still rehearsing tomorrow's worries. And even in the last waking moments of the day, it manages to whisper one final order into the dark, "I hope things get easier soon," which sounds hopeful, but is really just fear wearing its softest voice. And by the time this person finally falls asleep, she has given her money 7 or 8 quiet commands to stay small, to stay tight, to stay frightened, without ever once raising her voice or seeming dramatic about it at all. This is what Florence Scovel Shinn meant when she said, "Most people are hypnotized by appearances. They believe they are simply reacting to their circumstances, when in truth their circumstances are largely echoing the orders given the day before, and the day before that, stretching back for years. It is not the bank balance that is stubborn, it is the old self that keeps signing the same tired orders in the dark. And no amount of budgeting alone can outrun a voice that has never been named. Pause here for a moment and try something small with me. Think back over your own most recent ordinary day. Not a dramatic one, just an ordinary Tuesday or Wednesday. And see if you can find even 2 or 3 of these quiet orders hiding inside it. Maybe it was a sigh over a receipt. Maybe it was a joke made at your own expense about never having enough. Maybe it was simply a tired feeling that rose the moment you thought about your accounts. You do not need to judge what you find, you only need to see it. Because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that a habit brought into the light of simple awareness has already begun to lose its grip. It can no longer operate quite so freely once it has been noticed and named. So here is the 4th key in practice, and it unfolds the same way the day above unfolded. One moment at a time. First, you must catch the old self in the act, gently, without shame, simply noticing, there it is again, that old voice trying to speak for me. This noticing alone begins to loosen its grip, because a habit that is watched consciously can no longer hide in the dark and operate unquestioned. Second, once you notice it, you do not argue with it. You do not scold yourself for having thought it. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that resistance only feeds the very thing you resist. So instead, you simply and calmly replace the sentence where the old self said, "Another day of barely making it." You now say, quietly but firmly, "This is a day of abundant and unexpected supply." Where the old self said, "Must be nice. Some of us cannot afford that." You now say, "I am grateful for every good thing I see, because it shows me what is already on its way to me." Third, and this is the part most people skip, you begin to act, in small ordinary ways, as though the true self has already taken her rightful place. This does not mean reckless spending. It means quiet dignity. It means treating yourself, your home, your daily choices, the way someone treats things when they know deep down that they are provided for. Maybe it is something as small as setting the table properly for a meal alone, instead of eating standing at the counter, as though you do not deserve to sit. Maybe it is speaking to a cashier with warmth, instead of apology, when your card is declined by mistake. Maybe it is simply walking a little taller through your own kitchen. These are not surface changes. They are the visible evidence of an old self quietly stepping aside, and a true self quietly stepping forward. Think for a moment of a man who finally tries this. He has spent years apologizing to waiters, to landlords, to his own reflection, for simply needing things. And one evening, instead of ordering the cheapest item on the menu out of old habit, he pauses and orders what he actually wants, calmly, without announcing it, without guilt, and something in him exhales for the first time in years. That is not extravagance. That is the true self, quietly reclaiming a seat that was always hers to begin with. And Florence Scovel Shinn would say, this small, ordinary evening did more for his consciousness of supply than a month of anxious budgeting ever could. And there is a second small story worth sitting with here. A woman who had spent years keeping her good dishes locked away in a cabinet, saving them for some imagined future occasion that never quite arrived, using the chipped everyday plates for herself, while the beautiful ones gathered dust behind glass. And one ordinary Tuesday, for no special reason at all, she took the good dishes down and set her simple dinner upon them, and ate slowly, at her own table, as though she were someone worth serving well. Florence Scovel Shinn would say that this was not a small domestic choice. It was a decree, spoken not in words but in action, announcing to her own consciousness that the old self, who waited for permission to be treated well, had finally been allowed to step aside, and that a woman who already belonged to abundance had quietly taken her place instead. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this letting go is rarely one dramatic moment. It is usually 1,000 small ones, 1,000 tiny deaths of the old, tired voice, followed by 1,000 tiny births of the true and confident one. And slowly, almost without noticing exactly when it happened, you realize the tired voice speaks less often, and when it does speak, you no longer mistake it for the truth about who you are. You recognize it instantly now, the way you would recognize an old recording playing in another room, familiar, but no longer yours. It is not a punishment to release this old self. It is a mercy, and it is not a loss to let it go. It is the very thing that finally makes room for what was always meant to arrive. This is the death Florence Scovel Shinn spoke of. Not an ending of you, but an ending of the false idea of you, so that the real one, the one who was always meant to live in plenty, can finally take her seat at the table. I release the old self gently, and I let the true self live. Take a slow breath with me for a moment. If this teaching is doing something in you right now, let this be the moment you subscribe so the next one finds you. There is no rush here. Just stay close, because the next key builds directly on this one. The fifth key is this: cancel the old order before you give the new one. Florence Scovel Shinn taught her students a small but mighty practice. Whenever an old, fearful thought slipped out, whether spoken aloud or simply thought silently, to immediately say, "I cancel that word," and mean it, the way you would cancel a mistaken order at a counter before it could ever be filled. This matters because so many people try to build a beautiful new declaration directly on top of an old, fearful one, without ever clearing the old one away first. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this is like trying to write a new letter on top of an old one without ever erasing it. Both messages blur together, and the intention gets confused. Picture a teacher standing before a chalkboard still covered in yesterday's lesson. If she simply writes the new lesson directly over the old marks, without ever wiping the board clean, the students strain to read either one clearly, and neither lesson is truly taught. This is exactly what happens in consciousness, when a hopeful new word is spoken directly over an old fearful one. that was never cancelled. The two blur together, and the outer result comes back blurred as well. Half fear, half faith, and neither one strong enough to move anything. Think of a woman waiting to hear back after a job interview. Her phone sits quietly on the table, and every hour that passes without a call, a small fearful thought rises. They have probably already chosen someone else. If she lets that thought sit unchallenged, even while trying to speak positively elsewhere in her day, she has quietly filed a fresh order for disappointment. But instead, the moment she notices it rising, she catches it early and says, gently but firmly, "I cancel that word," and only then does she speak the true word in its place. The right opportunity is already mine, and I receive it in perfect timing. Notice the order there. Cancellation first, declaration second, never the other way around. Because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that a new word spoken without first cancelling the old one is a house built on ground that was never cleared. So imagine you are standing in line at the store, worrying whether your card will go through. And the fear thought rises. This is going to be embarrassing. Before that thought can settle in and take root as an order, you catch it, and quietly, even just inwardly, you say, "I cancel that word." And then, calmly, you replace it. This transaction completes with ease. That single act of cancellation is not superstition. It is housekeeping for the consciousness. Clearing the counter before setting down a new plate. Wiping the board clean before the golden word is written. This key is short because it is meant to be used quickly. In the very moment fear tries to speak first, and the more often you use it, the faster it becomes, until cancelling an old fearful thought feels as natural as wiping a smudge off a window. And once the counter of your mind is cleared this way, the next key shows you what to build there instead. I cancel every fearful word the instant it is spoken. The sixth key is this. Gratitude is the receipt that confirms an order already filled. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that thanksgiving spoken in advance, before the visible evidence has arrived, is one of the most powerful acts of faith a person can practice. Most people wait to feel grateful until the check clears, until the money is sitting visibly in the account. And by then, of course, gratitude is easy. Anyone can be thankful for what has already arrived. But Florence Scovel Shinn taught something far more useful. She taught her students to give thanks the moment the word was spoken, not after the proof appeared. Because gratitude given early is a statement of faith, and gratitude given only after the fact is merely a reaction to facts. And there is a world of difference between the two. One is spoken by a beggar admiring a gift already in hand. The other is spoken by an heir who already knows the inheritance is settled, long before it is ever counted out on the table in front of her. Think of a woman who has just spoken her order clearly. This bill is paid in full and on time, and instead of anxiously watching her account every hour to see if it worked, she simply says, "Thank you," as though the receipt were already sitting quietly in her hand. This is not pretending nothing is wrong. It is choosing to stand in the state of one who has already received. Because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the feeling of having received is the real substance behind every visible manifestation. It is not the manifestation itself that creates the feeling. It is the feeling that creates the manifestation. This is why she so often told her students, "Do not watch the how, watch your own state." Let me walk you through what this can look like across a single ordinary week. Because most people never realize how many small chances for advance gratitude pass them by, unused. On Monday, an invoice goes out. And instead of wondering all week whether the client will pay on time, a woman simply says, "Thank you that this is already settled," and lets the thought go. On Tuesday, a bill arrives in the mailbox. And instead of feeling the familiar tightening in her chest, she holds it for a moment and says, "Thank you, this is already provided for," before she has any visible sign that it is. On Wednesday, she remembers an old debt she has been quietly worrying over, and instead of rehearsing the worry one more time, she says, "Thank you, this is already resolved," In some way I have not yet seen. On Thursday, she applies for a small raise she has wanted for months, and rather than spending the rest of the day anxiously guessing at her odds, she simply whispers, "Thank you that this is already granted," and returns to her work in peace. And by Friday, something in her has genuinely settled, not because every single one of those situations has visibly resolved yet, but because she has spent the entire week standing in the receiving end of her own words, instead of the begging end of them. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this is exactly the posture that clears the channel for supply to move, because worry and thanksgiving cannot occupy the same space in consciousness at the same time. One always crowds the other out. The moment gratitude enters a room, fear has to leave it. There simply is not space for both to sit at the same table for very long. Consider also a man who has been praying about a specific sum he needs by the end of the month. Instead of checking his mailbox 3 times a day, growing more anxious with every empty visit, telling himself that no news is bad news, he simply says, each morning, "Thank you that this is already provided," and goes about his day in peace. And notice what this actually does. It does not deny that the money has not yet visibly appeared. It simply refuses to let that absence become the loudest voice in the room. This is not passivity. This is active faith, dressed in the quiet clothing of a settled heart. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that faith of this kind is never lazy. It is in fact one of the most disciplined postures a person can hold, because it takes far more strength to keep saying thank you into an empty mailbox than it does to simply panic at the sight of it. Anyone can panic. Panicking asks nothing of you, but standing quietly grateful in the middle of an unanswered question that asks everything of you, and that is precisely why it works. There is also a subtler side to this key, worth sitting with for a moment, because gratitude spoken in advance is not simply a technique to be performed correctly. It is a relationship to be lived honestly. If you find yourself saying the words "thank you" through gritted teeth, forcing the sentence out, while your whole body is still braced for disappointment, Florence Scovel Shinn would gently tell you that the words alone are not yet the receipt, they are only the beginning of one. So rather than straining to feel grateful all at once, you can start smaller. You can simply say, "I am willing to feel grateful for this before I see it," and let that willingness soften you a little more each day. Gratitude, like every state Florence Scovel Shinn taught, is something you grow into gradually, through gentle practice, not something you must summon perfectly on the very first try. So if the words feel stiff at first, that is not failure. That is simply the early stage of a receipt being written, before the ink has fully dried. So this week, practice saying thank you before the proof arrives, for the job, for the payment, for the raise, for the unexpected check. Whatever it is you have already spoken your word over, say it in the morning before you check anything. Say it quietly in the middle of an ordinary task. Say it again at night, regardless of what the day has shown you. And notice how differently your whole body feels when you thank rather than worry. Notice how your shoulders drop, how your breathing slows, how the whole tone of your day shifts, simply because you have stopped waiting for permission to feel at peace. Gratitude spoken in advance is not naive. It is not wishful. It is one of the most disciplined acts of faith there is, because it insists on being the receipt before the delivery is even visible. And once you learn to stand this steadily in gratitude, thanking before the evidence rather than after it, you are finally ready for the deepest key of all, the one that ties every other key together, the one that explains why the spoken word carries such tremendous weight to begin with. I give thanks now, as though the answer is already resting in my hand. The 7th key is this, and it is the deepest one we will walk through together tonight. So let us take it slowly, in 3 unfolding pieces, because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the word is not simply a description of your life, the word is the very wand that shapes it. And every other key we have already walked through tonight, the commanding, the self-concept, the guarded mouth, the dying of the old self, the cancelling of fear, the gratitude spoken in advance, has all been quietly preparing you to finally understand this one fully. First, consider the authority behind the word itself. Back to that centurion once more. In Matthew 8:9, notice that he never once mentions strength, or money, or clever strategy as the source of his power over his soldiers. He mentions only one thing: authority. I am a man under authority, having soldiers under me, and I say, and it is done. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this authority is not something you must earn through struggle. It is something you already carry, simply by being made in the image and likeness of an infinite, endlessly supplying source. This means your word already has weight. Whether you have ever noticed it or not, the question was never whether your word carries power. The question is only ever what you have been pointing that power toward. Picture a small shop owner opening her store before sunrise. She has 2 young clerks who look to her every morning for direction, and if she walks in uncertain, sighing about how slow business has been, wondering aloud whether today will be any different, her clerks feel that uncertainty settle into the room like a fog. They move slower, they doubt the register, they half expect a quiet day before a single customer has even walked through the door. But if that same woman walks in and says plainly, "Today is a good day for this shop. We open with expectation," her clerks straighten, they greet the first customer warmly. They carry themselves like people who already know something good is coming. Nothing outward had changed yet. The shelves held the same goods, the street held the same weather. Only the order given had changed. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that money behaves exactly like those clerks. It takes its cue from the tone of the one who speaks over it. And it is worth pausing here to notice how this same authority plays out in far quieter rooms than a shop. Think of a father sitting at his kitchen table with his teenage daughter, who asks him nervously whether the family will really be able to afford her school trip. If he sighs and says, "We will see, money is tight right now," he has not simply answered a question, he has spoken an order over the household, and that order settles into the very air of the home. But if instead he looks at her steadily and says, "That trip is already provided for, do not carry that worry another day," something shifts immediately in the room, not because the bank account changed in that instant, but because an authority was exercised instead of an anxiety confessed. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this authority does not belong only to shop owners and centurions. It belongs to every single person who has ever opened their mouth to speak. The mother at the stove, the young man filling out a rental application, the woman standing quietly at the pharmacy counter hoping her insurance covers the cost. Every one of them carries the very same wand, whether they have ever been told so or not. For years, most people point this tremendous authority at their fears, describing shortage in vivid, convincing detail, worrying out loud about bills, rehearsing disaster before it has even had the chance to happen. And every time they do, they are using the very same wand the centurion used, only pointed backward, aimed at the very thing they never wanted. It is not weakness that keeps most people poor. It is misdirected authority, spoken faithfully, decade after decade, toward the wrong outcome. This is the first piece of the deepest key, recognizing that you have never been powerless, you have simply been misaimed, and the moment you realize your word has always carried this authority, you can finally begin aiming it on purpose. Second, consider the state that stands behind the word. Because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that words spoken without a settled state behind them are like a soldier shouting orders no one actually believes he has the right to give. The soldiers may hesitate, or worse, they may simply not move at all. This is why some people can speak an affirmation 100 times and see nothing change, while another person speaks the very same words once, from a quiet, unshakable state, and watches circumstances rearrange themselves within days. The difference was never the words themselves, it was the state the words were standing on. return for a moment to that same shop owner. Imagine her saying the very sentence, "This shop is provided for," on two different mornings. On the first morning, she says it with her jaw tight, her eyes darting toward the empty register drawer, her shoulders rounded forward as though bracing for bad news. And Florence Scovel Shinn would say that beneath that sentence, the true and dominant message being sent out is still fear, dressed up in borrowed clothing. On the second morning, she says the very same sentence, slowly, unhurried, almost amused, the way she might mention that the sky looks clear today. Because for her, on that morning, the sentence is no longer a wish. It has become simply a fact she is stating out loud. It is not the sentence that changed between those two mornings. It is the woman standing behind it. Think also of two people side by side, filling out the very same loan application. One of them fills in the numbers with a knot in her stomach, whispering under her breath, "They will probably reject this like the last one," and mailing it off already defeated. The other fills in the very same numbers calmly, almost lightly, saying quietly to herself, "The right resources are already mine," and sealing the envelope without a second thought. The paperwork is identical. The numbers are identical. And yet Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the consciousness behind each envelope is entirely different. And it is the consciousness, far more than the paperwork, that the outer world is truly responding to. This is why she spent so much of her teaching, not on which words to say, but on how to actually shift the state underneath them, through relaxation, through release, through letting go of the anxious grip most people keep on their own circumstances. A tense hand cannot hold a wand steady, no matter how correct the words spoken through it. Words spoken from a tense, grasping state tend to attract exactly the tense, grasping conditions that state matches, while words spoken from a calm, expectant state tend to attract calm, timely, almost graceful supply. Notice too that this state cannot be faked for long through sheer effort of will. Gritted teeth and a forced smile do not fool the deeper consciousness that is actually giving the orders. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the state must be genuinely entered, even if only for a moment, the way you might step fully into a warm room after standing outside in the cold. And once you have felt that warmth, even once, you know the difference forever between a word merely spoken and a word truly meant. This is the second piece of the deepest key. The word is the wand, but the state is the hand that holds it steady, and an unsteady hand, no matter how beautiful the words, produces an unsteady result. Third, consider the follow-through after the word has been spoken, because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that a decree, spoken and then immediately contradicted by anxious behavior, is like a soldier who gives an order and then runs to double-check it was heard, again and again and again, undermining his own authority with every anxious glance backward. This is perhaps the most overlooked piece of this entire teaching. People speak a beautiful, confident decree in the morning, and then spend the rest of the day checking their bank balance every hour, sighing at every bill that arrives, telling a friend over lunch how worried they secretly are, and then wondering, days later, why nothing seems to have shifted. Picture that same shop owner once more. She has spoken her word over the day, and now the real test begins. Not in the speaking, but in the hours that follow. If every time a customer walks past without buying anything, she mutters under her breath that today is turning out just as slow as she feared, she has quietly cancelled her own morning order without even realizing it. But if instead she keeps stocking her shelves, keeps greeting each person who enters with the same warmth regardless of whether they buy anything at all, keeps trusting the word she spoke before the sun was even fully up, she is doing exactly what Florence Scovel Shinn taught her students to do. She is letting the order stand, undisturbed. Think again of that same father at the kitchen table. He has spoken his word that the trip is already provided for, and now, over the following days, the true test arrives quietly, in ordinary moments. When a bill comes due that same week, Does he groan in front of his daughter and mutter that money is tighter than he let on? Or does he simply pay what needs paying, calmly, and go on with his evening as a man who trusts the word he already spoke? When a co-worker mentions layoffs at the plant down the road, does he come home and repeat the worry at dinner, planting fresh fear over the very seed he planted in faith days earlier? Or does he let that conversation pass through him without taking root? Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this steady, undramatic follow-through is where most spoken words are actually lost, not in the speaking, which is often done beautifully, but in the ordinary hours afterward, where old habits of anxious rehearsal quietly creep back in and take the word back before it ever has the chance to bear fruit. This does not mean ignoring practical responsibilities. It does not mean recklessness. It means carrying yourself, in your ordinary daily choices, the way someone carries themselves when they already know the outcome. Imagine her, at the end of that day, closing the register without anxiously recounting it 3 times out of fear, simply closing it calmly, the way a person closes a drawer they already trust is in order. This quiet, ordinary faithfulness after the word is spoken is exactly what Florence Scovel Shinn meant when she said that faith without corresponding action remains only a wish. The action she meant was rarely dramatic. It was simply the steady, undramatic behavior of someone who already believes she has been heard. It is not the loud declaration in the morning that finishes the work. It is the quiet refusal, hour after hour, to take the order back. So bring all 3 pieces together for a moment. The authority that says your word has always carried weight, the state that determines how much weight it actually carries when spoken, and the follow-through that protects the word after it has left your mouth. And you begin to understand why Florence Scovel Shinn placed the spoken word at the very center of her entire teaching. It was never about magic words or lucky phrases. It was about a person finally remembering who they were speaking as. A person under authority, yes, but an authority given to bring supply and life, not scarcity and struggle. Money has ears, and it has been waiting this whole time, not for louder words, but for truer ones, spoken from a settled place and left standing without interference. And once that person speaks from that remembered place, calm, expectant, and then simply walks forward without anxious glancing backward, the very soldiers of circumstance that once seemed so slow to move begin, often quietly, sometimes quite suddenly, to obey. My word carries authority, and I stand steady enough to let it work. The 8th key is this: guard the gate of your speech, not only for your own words, but for the words others speak over your supply as well. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that other people's fearful words, spoken carelessly around you, can act like unwanted orders slipping past an open gate. If you allow them to settle in unquestioned, think of how often a well-meaning relative says something like, "Money does not grow on trees, you know." Or a co-worker sighs and says, "We will never get ahead in this economy." These are not simply opinions floating past you harmlessly. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that any word spoken with enough feeling behind it carries a small charge of creative power, and if you receive it into your own consciousness without resistance, nodding along, agreeing, repeating it later as though it were simply how the world works, you have quietly let someone else's fear become an order running in your own account. This is why she taught her students to become gentle but firm gatekeepers, not rude, not combative, simply aware. When someone speaks scarcity in your presence, you do not have to argue with them out loud. You can simply, silently, decline to receive it. Some of her students practiced a quiet inward phrase for exactly this moment. "That is not my word, and I do not accept it," spoken silently while the other person is still talking. This is not coldness. It is self-protection, the same way you would not leave your front door open to every stranger who wandered by, simply because they seemed friendly. Let me walk you through an ordinary week and show you how many gates are left open without anyone even noticing. On Monday morning, A co-worker leans over the desk and says, "Brace yourself, layoffs are coming to this department." And if you simply nod and carry that sentence with you for the rest of the day, turning it over at lunch, mentioning it again at dinner, you have not merely heard a rumor, you have taken in an order and begun feeding it with your attention. On Tuesday, your phone shows you a headline about the cost of everything rising, and if you scroll further, letting the fear in the comments beneath it soak into you for 20 minutes, you have opened the gate wider still. On Wednesday, a friend calls just to vent and says, "I am so tired of never having enough." And if you answer with, "Oh, I know exactly what you mean. Tell me about it," you have joined your own word to hers, and now two people are holding the same fear open instead of one. Florence Scovel Shinn would say that none of these moments felt dramatic, none of them felt like a decision, and that is exactly the danger. The gate is rarely stormed, it is simply left ajar, one small unguarded agreement at a time, until by Friday, a person wonders why the whole week has felt so heavy, without ever realizing they were the one who kept letting the heaviness in. So here is the practice this key asks of you. Pause for a moment and picture one voice in your own life that tends to speak scarcity around you most often. Perhaps it is a parent, a sibling, a co-worker who narrates disaster every chance they get, and instead of steeling yourself to fight them or convincing yourself to avoid them entirely, simply decide in advance how you will stand at the gate the next time they speak. You can listen with warmth. You can even offer comfort. But inwardly, you hold the quiet line, "That is not my word, and I do not accept it." Imagine sitting at a family dinner while someone recounts, in vivid and worried detail, all the ways the economy is falling apart, and instead of absorbing every word and carrying it home with you like a stone in your pocket, you listen kindly, you offer a warm word if it is needed, and then, quietly, you release their fear back to them, refusing to let it settle into your own expectation for your own life. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this kind of gatekeeping is an act of love, both for yourself and, indirectly, for them, because a person standing firmly in abundant consciousness is a far greater help to a worried friend than one who simply joins them in their fear. Misery may love company, but it was never Florence Scovel Shinn's teaching that you should provide it. Better to be the one steady voice at the table than one more person, adding weight to a room already heavy with it. This eighth key also applies to the media you consume, the conversations you seek out, the accounts you follow, because every one of these is, in a sense, a voice speaking words toward your consciousness, and you have every right, indeed every responsibility, to choose carefully what you allow through the gate. This does not mean living in denial of the world around you. It does not mean covering your ears to every hard fact or pretending difficulty does not exist. It means simply refusing to let every anxious voice you encounter become an unquestioned command over your own personal supply. You can know the news without living inside it. You can love a worried friend without borrowing her worry as your own. And once you have learned to guard this gate faithfully, both from your own careless words and from the borrowed fears of others, you arrive, quite naturally, at a place of rest, which is exactly where the final key gently leads us. I guard my gate, and only true words are welcome here. The ninth key is this. Having given the order, rest, Florence Scovel Shinn taught that once a word has been spoken clearly, from a settled state, and once the gate has been guarded, and the old fearful voice gently released, the final and perhaps most graceful step is simply to rest. And she was careful to say that this rest is not laziness, it is not neglect, it is not turning your back on your ordinary responsibilities. It is releasing the anxious watching that so many people quietly mistake for diligence, as though worry were somehow doing work, when in truth, worry has never once finished a single order. It only ever delays it. Think for a moment of a gardener who plants a seed in the evening and then cannot help herself. and digs it back up every morning to check whether the roots have started. She means well. She is not lazy. She is simply frightened. But every time she disturbs that seed to satisfy her fear, she sets its growth back further than if she had simply trusted the soil and walked away. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that a spoken word is exactly this kind of seed, planted the moment it leaves your mouth from a true and settled state, and the anxious checking so many people do afterward, the refreshing of the account, the retelling of the worry to a friend, the rehearsing of every way it might fail, is nothing more than digging up the very seed you just planted. Consider a man who has been waiting to hear about a position he applied for. He has spoken his word clearly. This opportunity is mine, on time and in the right way. And now he has two paths in front of him. One path has him checking his phone every few minutes, refreshing his email, growing tighter in his chest with every passing hour that no reply comes. The other path has him simply living his ordinary evening, finishing his dinner, calling his mother, sleeping soundly, not because he does not care about the outcome, but because he has already handed the order to the very authority he trusts. And Florence Scovel Shinn would say that the second man, the resting man, is doing the deeper work, because he understands what the centurion understood so long ago, that a soldier under true command does not need his officer hovering anxiously over him to carry out an order already given. The hovering itself would insult the very authority that gave it. And here is the gentle truth beneath this final key. It is not the loud, dramatic decree that finishes the work. It is the quiet, undramatic trust that follows it. It is not endless vigilance that protects a word already spoken well. It is peaceful release that lets it move unhindered through the very channels it was meant to travel. So tonight, as we close, let this be the resting place you return to. Again and again, you have spoken. You have guarded your gate. You have released the old anxious self and welcomed the true and settled one. And now, simply, gently, you rest, knowing that money, like every soldier standing rightly under authority, moves according to the order it was given, and needs no anxious supervision from you to do it faithfully. I have spoken, and now I rest, knowing it is already done. Here is the whole picture. It is not asking that moves money. It is commanding from a settled state. It is not your bank statement that decides your supply. It is your concept of self. It is not casual talk. It is a decree spoken through an open gate. It is not the ending of you when the old self dissolves. It is the true self finally set free. It is not endless repetition that gives a word power. It is the cancellation of fear that clears the way for it. It is not the manifestation that creates the feeling of having received. It is the feeling of having received that creates the manifestation. It is not loud, desperate declaration that moves mountains. It is quiet authority resting on a steady state, followed by calm, undramatic action. It is not other people's fearful words that must become your own. It is your gate, and you decide what passes through it. And it is not anxious watching that finishes an order. It is peaceful rest. And when you look closely, you see that these 9 keys were truly never 9 separate things at all. They were 9 turns of the very same key. The recognition that your word has always been a wand, and that money, along with every form of supply in your life, has been listening for the sound of your true authority this entire time. And if this teaching has stirred something steady and quiet in you tonight, if you find yourself wanting to walk this path daily instead of only watching it once and letting it fade by morning, there is a small companion for that. It is called the Overflow Covenant, a simple daily practice built directly on these same principles, gentle decrees, short daily reflections, and a steady rhythm of consciousness work designed to keep your word aimed exactly where you want it aimed. It is $33. It carries a full 30-day money-back promise, so there is truly nothing to risk in trying it. And the link is waiting for you in the description below whenever you are ready. No pressure, only an open door. Because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that supply always moves toward those who keep the door open and the word steady. Say it with me one final time. Money hears me now. Money moves for me now. My word is my wand. And as you go on from here tonight, walk gently, walk certainly, remembering that money has always had ears, and that from this moment forward, it is finally listening to the true and settled voice of you,